Hey, Cal, when's the last time you were in Singapore?
I was there in 2016. Actually, I did a speaking tour for the State Department and saw you and a lot of other folks and had a great time. For some reason, a lot of people seem to think, oh, Singapore is kind of like, I don't know. I guess it has a reputation as being kind of like a, I don't know, antiseptic place or something like that. I loved it. I thought it was great. My wife and I had a fabulous time.
Well, we had a good time together, and I've lived here for more than 17 years, so I better like it. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that was striking to me too was, so we went up on, I can't remember the name of the hotel, but it kind of looks like a big boat.
Marina Bay Sands.
Yeah, and we went up there, and there's like a sky deck up there, and so you could see the whole city. And of course, there's all sorts of brand new construction and tons of skyscrapers. But the thing that was really striking to me was all of the activity at the port. Now, maybe it's not like that right now, given what's going on, but I mean, Singapore, that's one of the I don't know, two, three, four busiest ports in the world or something like that. So just so much economic activity, and I just thought it was a really cool place.
Well, we can't wait to have you back. It may be a little bit, but
Yeah, no, I would love to go back. We had a great time.
we'll bring you back for the post-election tour, and you can explain why what happened when you come back.
I suppose if it's safe to do so at that time, who knows?
Let's hope we're good by 2021. Hey,
I
so
would hope so, but
yeah.
hey, who knows?
So, hey, look, you're managing editor of the Crystal Ball. Maybe just explain what the Crystal Ball is and why it was created, what function it has.
Sure. So the Crystal Ball newsletter has been around for almost 20 years. It is a product of the University of Virginia Center for Politics, where I work as the communications director, and I'm also our Washington D.C. Director, and so I'm based in Washington. And I telecommute, so this is actually all old hat for me. I've been telecommuting for years, although obviously it's a lot different for a lot of other people. But so anyway, the Crystal Ball has been around for almost 20 years, and it was the creation of our director, Professor Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia, and Larry would do lots of presentations about election forecasting and things in the 80s and 90s, and it eventually kind of morphed into a more kind of formal newsletter. So the Crystal Ball first started covering elections in 2002, and I've been at the Crystal Ball since 2011. So this is my third presidential cycle and fifth election cycle ever. There, American elections, you basically look at them in sort of 2-year increments, where at the end of the road is either a midterm election where control of the House and Senate is often at stake, and many of the governors are elected, and then of course the presidential year, where not so many governors are elected, but of course the whole House and a third of the U.S. Senate seats are up too.
And so of course you'll see I'm wearing my UVA championship T-shirt, and had Professor Sabato as an undergrad at UVA. So obviously I have so close and fond memories, but who's your audience now? I mean, is it university students? Is it people like me, or is it a much broader audience?
It is a pretty broad audience. We actually just we're sort of looking at our readership, and there are a lot of people affiliated with UVA who read the Crystal Ball, but probably 3/4 of our readers or more are people who are political professionals. I think campaigns pay attention to us. We have a number of teachers across the country and really across the world who get civics education programs through or educational materials through our Youth Leadership Initiative program, which is another part of the Center for Politics. We sometimes will talk to diplomats from other countries who, of course, are here and trying to, figure out what's going on in American politics. So I think we have kind of a diplomatic readership. There are business folks who read us, and so it's a group of readers who are really kind of politics nerds and really care about this stuff and like to kind of have in-depth coverage. But it's a wide-ranging group of people who care about politics.
And obviously the Crystal Ball is so named because you're gazing, and trying to predict the future and who's going to win and why and what to watch. How much influence does the Crystal Ball have in terms of where people are going to donate their money in terms of campaigns, or where people are going to sit out? I mean, how do you see yourself fitting into that atmosphere?
So that's not something that we really, that we're trying to do in that we're not really trying to, influence donation decisions and that, because I guess we don't necessarily see that is appropriate. But at the same time, I don't think there's any question that we do influence those sorts of things to some degree, and that there are a lot of donors who follow the ratings from us and also from other handicappers, the Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, other folks who do these, race by race projections. And actually, there was a guy named Noah Rudnick who's written for us before and is really sharp. Person just out of college from Ohio State, and he was doing some research during the 2018 cycle, and he indicated that you could actually see donation changes when ratings changed, either for us or for Cook or for others, and that there was some influence that we were exercising. And again, that's not really what we're trying to do, but I think for a lot of people, particularly the donor class, they're getting hit up by so many different people to give money to various campaigns, and they need some independent voice to say, hey, maybe this campaign is probably in better shape than that campaign, and maybe your money's better spent there. And I mean, again, we don't directly give that advice to people, but I don't think there's any question that there are folks in the political arena, donors, et cetera, who will follow us and will sort of make some of their decisions based on what they see from us, or again, some of the other reputable rating groups.
And when you rate a race, president, House, Senate, whatever, governor, whatever it may be, you put it in different categories. There could be a toss-up, or a lean Democrat, lean Republican, likely. What are those different gradations, and how do you determine if something is a toss-up versus a lean versus a likely?
Yeah, and we often get asked, hey, what sort of percentage corresponds with toss-up or leans or likely? And I guess for toss-up, it's pretty easy in that you sort of look at those as being kind of 50-50 coin flip kinds of races. Leans is sort of competitive, but we think that one side is favored over the other. Likely is sort of more favored, and then safe is we basically see zero chance of the other party winning the seat. And in American elections, in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, typically in a given year, a majority of the Senate seats being contested are safe for one party or the other. And in the House, it's really very stark in that you'd expect 3/4 or more of the U.S. House seats to be safe for one party or the other. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of the reasons that often gets cited is gerrymandering, which is, sort of the practice utilized by both parties, probably more by Republicans lately, just because they've had more power to do so at the state level. But this idea that parties are drawing safe seats for one another, but there would be a ton of safe seats even if all the districts were drawn in a kind of a nonpartisan way, in that if you look at places like, for instance, the 5 boroughs of New York City, other than a few parts of the city, you'd be very hard pressed to draw anything other than a landslide Democratic district in New York City. And you're talking about millions of people who live in the same place, and it's just not a competitive place. You could say the same thing about San Francisco or Los Angeles or Chicago, in that most parts of those big cities are landslide Democratic areas. At the same time, if you are in many rural states and sort of the heartland states, or some parts of the South, you're not going to be able to draw a competitive district in western Nebraska or western Kansas or northern Texas, or a lot of places that are just very, very Republican. Some of them have been Republican for decades and decades, if not centuries, going back to the founding of the GOP right before the Civil War in 1850 in the 1850s. So again, a lot of these races are not competitive, but there are still, dozens in the House, and usually at least a strong handful in the Senate that are competitive, and those are the ones that get watched, and the money flows to those races.
And in terms of those, toss-ups, of course, and then there's toss-ups when it comes to the states for the presidential election. And so before we talk about what those key states are for 2020, I'd like to go back, to 2016. Where was the crystal ball in its prediction of Trump versus, Hillary Clinton going into the election?
So we had Clinton favored, just like, many others did. And, it's sort of easy to say after the fact, oh, well, you should have picked Trump, et cetera. But it was a very strange race. And I think there were some lessons that you could pull from it that I think might be helpful looking forward here. And that is, first of all, you had 2 presidential candidates in Clinton and Trump who really both had very poor national favorability numbers, to the point where about a fifth of the whole electorate in exit polling, polls conducted of people after they voted, about a fifth of all the voters said they didn't like either. They had an unfavorable view of both Clinton and Trump. And those voters ended up kind of moving more toward Trump at the end. Trump won that group 47% to 30%, and then the remaining 20-25% went to the third party candidates. And so overall, 6% of the electorate voted for third party candidates. But in these polls, Clinton would often lead, but her leads were more like, 45-42 or something like that, not that close to 50. And 50 is always, the magic number you kind of look for in polls. And also you would have a high number of undecideds, and also a higher number of people saying that they plan to vote third party. And what usually happens in American politics, maybe in other countries too, although I just really study American politics and specifically, usually when voters will say they're going to vote third party, and then at the end they decide to vote for one of the two major parties because they just decide that they want to make sure that they have more of an influence on the outcome. And so a lot of undecideds, a lot of sort of inflated number of third party voters. I think the polls sometimes were maybe less clear than maybe what sort of the top line horse race number between Clinton and Trump ended up being. And, there were certain points of the election where it really did look like a legitimate toss-up. I'd say specifically in late September in 2016. But then you had the Access Hollywood tape come out about Trump. Clinton generally was judged by majorities to have won the 3 debates, but then I think things kind of broke poorly for Clinton at the end. And so it may have been that if the election were, 2 weeks later or 2 weeks earlier, that Clinton would have done better. But of course, that doesn't matter. The election was when it was, and Trump ended up winning. And I will say, in hindsight, that the pieces were there to try to put together. Although I think just as a matter of odds, Clinton was probably probably the easier person to pick, which I think is why a lot of us ended up doing it. That was not a shining moment for the prognostication industry. Although I think many of us, including Crystal Ball, really bounced back pretty well in 2018.
And so as we head into 2020, now that Donald Trump, obviously on the ballot, running for re-election, but against Joe Biden as opposed to Hillary Clinton, are there any lessons you take from 2016 as you begin your forecasting for 2020? Or is 2016 a one-off, that Hillary Clinton was just so different from Joe Biden, there's nothing really to learn from it?
Well, look, I do think that in these polls, I am looking to see how close Biden is to 50% of these polls. And generally, he's been a little bit more consistently closer to 50%. But also, the national polls don't really mean all that much, because the national popular vote, did not really project the Electoral College last time. Clinton won by 2 percentage points in the popular vote, but Trump got over 300 electoral votes out of 538 available. So really did quite well, although the race was essentially decided in a number of close states. I'd say most notably some states in kind of the old industrial heartland, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And, those are the states that we're really watching this time. And, I think to feel good about Biden winning, if you're a Biden supporter, is, you don't want to just see Biden up, 1, 2, 3 points in some of these states. You want to be up more like 4 or 5 and close to 50%. And I personally, he's not quite there yet, which is why I think that this election is still a toss-up. Although, one of the other things from 2016 is that there are these big picture indicators that analysts sometimes look at. We call them sort of the election fundamentals, basically things that the campaigns don't really control, but that have a proven effect on voter behavior historically. So things like, what's the incumbent president's approval rating, whether there's an incumbent on the ballot, what's the state of the economy, issues of war and peace, et cetera. And for most of Trump's presidency, you would have said that those factors actually look good for Trump, in that his numbers were kind of artificially low because people generally liked where the country was, even though they didn't maybe personally like the president and his behavior. Well, now the so-called fundamentals, I think, argue strongly against Trump, in that we've got this horrible pandemic going on. The state of the economy is, I think we're only beginning to realize what the real ramifications are and how long it will last. And so from that standpoint, the president may have gone from favorite to underdog, but these circumstances are so unique that we don't quite know how people will react. And also, we may get to a point where it looks like the president is really flailing in the summer, but then maybe he can make a comeback in the fall if people's perceptions of him improve, or rather, more importantly, people's perceptions of the state of the country improve.
So today, as you mentioned, there's 538 electoral votes spread across the country with each state allocated a set amount. You need half, so you need 270 to win. Your count today, where do you have Biden and Trump and then the toss-ups?
So we have Biden at 248, we have Trump at 233, and then we have, do the math about it, 50, I think it's 54 states worth of toss-ups. So it's Arizona, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then a single electoral vote in the state of Nebraska. There are a couple of states, Maine and Nebraska, that award their electoral votes by congressional district, so you could actually lose the state but still win an electoral vote or two from those states. But that's where we have it right now. So I guess you could say Biden is nominally ahead, but neither of them are rated over 270 in our ratings, and so we basically think it's a 50-50 kind of race.
And what are those key states that you think we should be watching that are really going to determine the election this time around? You didn't mention Michigan, which Trump won last time. I don't think you mentioned. I can't remember if you mentioned Wisconsin or Pennsylvania this time around. So what are those states that are the ones we should be watching?
So I think most analysts have kind of really focused on half a dozen states, and some of them I already mentioned: Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Michigan, where we see Biden is slightly favored. We think that was kind of one of the flukier of Trump's wins. It was very close, and I think basically with just a little bit of a better turnout operation, the Democrats could probably flip Michigan, but we'll see. State's still very competitive. And then you got Florida, which is always very close, but seems to favor Republicans more often than not. So I'd give Trump a little bit of an edge in that state. And then again, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, we all have his toss-ups. And so I think those 6 states are probably crucial. I think if you've got one candidate who wins a majority of those states, they probably will get elected, although you could come up with you might be able to come up with different other scenarios involving other states in which that doesn't necessarily have to happen. But those are the ones that I'm fixated on the most.
And is the state of the economic recovery, come Labor Day, which is early September through Election Day? I mean, is that going to be the biggest factor in the election, or are there other things that are going to play into it as well?
I mean, historically, people actually second quarter GDP, April through June, is one that political scientists often use to try to project election outcomes. It's interesting that it's not third quarter GDP, so it's not closer to the election. But people who've looked at this have found that second quarter is more suggestive in that I think sometimes people's perceptions of the economy can kind of lag whatever reality is. And of course, it's not just like people look at what the GDP growth number and say, oh, well, it's 3, so I'm going to vote for the incumbent. And if it's 2, I'm not going to vote for the incumbent or something. It's not that, it's not that specific of a thing. I think GDP growth is just a good catch-all for what the state of the economy is. It looks like second quarter GDP growth might be the worst quarter in the post-World War II era. The worst quarter since the war was -10 in the first quarter of 1958. That isn't commonly thought of as a bad economic time, but there was a period in the late 50s that was really quite bad, and for a number of different reasons. But it seems like, again, I'm not an economic forecaster, but based on what some of the economic forecasters are saying, that Q2 in 2020 is going to be worse than that in the United States, worse than -10. But again, also, the economy may not be as much of a driver of public opinion as it used to be, in that with both Obama and with Trump, their approval ratings were really very steady throughout their presidencies. Obama's was generally a little bit better, but not markedly that much better. Maybe you'd say Obama was sort of in the mid to high 40s for much of his presidency, and Trump was more like low to mid 40s. But I think a lot of people are sort of deciding on politics based on kind of political tribalism. There's a term in American politics called negative partisanship, and it's basically that a lot of people kind of dislike the other side more than they like their own side, and that sort of animates their voting. Certainly, I'd say the president is good at reminding Republicans of who their enemies are, and I think he generates a lot of loyalty to himself by being very aggressive against those folks. I'd say the problem for the president is that in a time where you've seen a lot of state governors and also world leaders in other countries have this rally around the flag effect in the face of this faced with this crisis, and it shows up in approval polling, and that you see some folks like Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, um, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Mike DeWine of Ohio. Their approval is it's all way up, 20 points or something like that. With Trump, it went up 2-3 points, and then it seems like it's fading back down. And I think with the president is doing all these press conferences every day, and again, I think that the way he behaves sort of reinforces how people already feel about him. And so on one hand, you could say, well, he's not sinking, but I would also say he's not necessarily expanding his level of support, and arguably he needs to. For as much as we focus on what Biden needs to do, you do have Trump as the incumbent president, who is clearly behind nationally, and is at best in a dogfight in some of the key states that delivered him the presidency.
And I guess my last question for you will be, you're sitting here in Singapore now, it's mid-April. We're in the midst of our second wave, of the coronavirus, and so we're much more, to use a common word, locked down than we were beforehand. For me to hear people say, well, we're going to have the national conventions, and for the Democrats and the Republicans in August, we're going to bring 50,000 people to Wisconsin, 50,000 people to Charlotte, North Carolina for the Republicans. I mean, that's crazy. I cannot see there being any conventions other than virtual ones. I don't see how you're going to be doing rallies. I don't see how you're going to be doing big fundraisers. Maybe we'll get to the point of a small group fundraiser, but if it's going to be fundamentally different. And you've got Donald Trump, in the White House, broadcasting every day, and you got Joe Biden in his basement, kind of like what you and I are doing, right now. How big an advantage is that going to be for the president, or are we just in so uncharted territory it's unknown?
I think we're in uncharted territory. I would also say that in 2016 anyway, that I think that the president often did better when he was not dominating the news. And I don't know if being in the public space every day is honestly that good for him. I sometimes wonder if he'd be better off if he went away for a couple of weeks and was not reminding people, yes, why they like him, but also why they don't like him. So Biden is also someone who, frankly, is not that strong of a candidate. And so, I guess he'd like to be out there more, but if he's not out there that much, it maybe it focuses the public's mind even more on the election being a referendum on Trump as opposed to a choice between Trump and Biden. I think the Trump campaign wants it to be a choice, because if it's a straight referendum, I think Trump's going to have a hard time winning. And as for the conventions, who knows? And the president certainly seems determined to hold it. We've already heard from Biden in which he sort of suggested that even though the Democrats already have moved back their convention a month, that it may have to be done virtually. But you also have to remember, just because an event may be held doesn't mean that it's going to be as big as it was in the past. Are folks going to want to go? I think, there are 20,000 media members at these conventions. There'll be a lot of people who end up going, but like for instance, like we've gone to the conventions in the past. Will we determine it's necessary to go? Maybe not. And even some of the delegates who may feel like they might be at risk, or loved ones might be at risk, they may not want to go either. So I think the both parties are going to have to be pretty flexible in this, and we also don't know if this will seem like maybe it goes away in the summer and then maybe kind of comes back in the fall. That's also important too, because if people are reminded of coronavirus right before the election, that would presumably have some sort of impact on voter choice. So again, lots of unknowns. I would say that the president, I think, was in better position before this happened than now that it has happened. But I also wouldn't say that it's going to end his presidency necessarily. Again, I look at the numbers, and they just don't move all that much. And a lot of the states that are most competitive remain pretty competitive.
Well, look, I know you and I will keep emailing, but I'd love to talk to you on Zoom again, maybe in a few months, and
Sure.
see what's played out, because we're in a campaign season that is going to be we have an unprecedented president, we have an unprecedented historical situation. So getting your insights is going to be just outright fascinating.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Happy to do it.
And say hello to Professor Sabato for me, of course.
I certainly will.
All right. Thanks so much, Kyle.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. See ya.
See ya.